welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Stephanie Rozene, and with me again today is Garth Johnson, the Paul Phillips and Sharon Sullivan Curator of Ceramics at the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York. Welcome back again, Garth.
Thank you, Stephanie. It is so good to be here.
So last week, we looked at how the funk art movement spawned this kind of really incredible range of artists who changed the way that the art world saw ceramics. And so this week, we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to explore the life of Clayton Bailey and the nut artists, a movement that saw ceramics take us to another universe, quite literally. So before we head off into outer space, we're going to look at where this all started with that little show that we've been talking about from UC Berkeley, Funk. And it introduced us and the world to a lot of different ceramic artists, but one in particular, Peter Volkos. And you and I know that he's a really important to this story. He is sort of like the first person to take a lead from the abstract expressionist movement, artists working in the 1950s in New York City. And he's the first person who kind of decides that a pot doesn't always need to look like a pot, right? So we're at this moment where everything's changing with him. And he's really pushing back against traditional norms in ceramics. And he's influencing the next generation of students who are influencing the next generation and the next generation, right? He is working in a way where he's pushing and pinching and squishing the clay, which is really, it's revolutionary. And he starts giving lectures, right? He travels around the country. He gives demonstrations at different universities, and students are getting turned on by these new ideas. And so are the teachers, right? And let's like, we're going to cast our eyes to the Midwest. And we're gonna find the teacher in this scenario is Harvey Littleton, and the student is Clayton Bailey. So tell me a little bit about that.
So Harvey Littleton is an absolutely legendary figure, but not necessarily in ceramics. He goes on to revolutionize studio glass and really found the studio glass movement in the United States, which, you know, I've got to say, studio glass is perhaps even more irreverent than ceramics, you know. So it's interesting that Littleton is, you know, well connected. He's thoughtful. He really fosters this incredible studio ethos, but he brings in Peter Volkos. And so Peter Volkos comes in and does a workshop at some point in, I think, the late 50s or perhaps 1960. And that's where Clayton Bailey comes in contact with the idea of abstract expressionist ceramics. But crucially, you know, Littleton is absorbing all of these things too. And Clayton Bailey is a lot of things, but slavish imitator is not one of them. In fact, he goes so out of his way to not make work like his teacher, Harvey Littleton, that he starts coil building things together and starts making sculptures that are, you know, fingerprinty and visceral, really as a way to make things that were the absolute opposite of his teacher. And, you know, I think that's a huge part of his personality and a lot of people who are part of this, you know, formative funk movement. So, you know, I'm going to make the controversial assertion,
bring it
here and now, that Clayton Bailey creates the very first funk object and not Robert Arneson. It's interesting that Robert Arneson, when he makes his no deposit, no return beer bottle at the state fair, it's performative. He's on stage in front of people. But it's a small act of turning this bottle into a non-functional sculpture.
Yeah.
But it's not funky. It's not really distinct from pop. On the other hand, in 1961, you have Clayton Bailey, and he starts to create this body of work that he calls critters. And so these are not thrown on the potter's wheel. They're made of coils of clay, or they're made of masses of clay. And so the first piece that I would credit as a funk object also comes from 1961, and it's called Caterpillar with Flying Buttresses. And so it is a lump of clay that he's formed with his hands, and then using his fingers to squish the clay, he's making forms that look like flying buttresses on a Gothic cathedral. So this has it all, you know? It has this death and dump fingerprinty viscerality, yet it also has art history, and you can, you know, think back to your art history, you know, B seminar as a freshman learning about Gothic cathedrals. And it's got humor. It really, you know, contains multitudes at a time, you know, when I think Robert Arneson's work was kind of one note, to put it that way.
And Bailey's making that work as a student.
So I think Bailey by this time has graduated from University of Wisconsin, and you know, we do have to say that Madison is a terrific counterculture atmosphere, but it is plunked in the Midwest. But by this time, Clayton Bailey is out on his own. I think he might be in St. Louis at this point, and
for the critters.
he actually does a first exhibition. I think it's at a sort of community art center. It's reviewed in the paper, and scathingly. You know, I think scathingly. The local art critic did not have like great things to say about his exhibition, but of course this gives him fuel, and he keeps working. I have to mention someone who is in that axis, Paul J. Smith of the Contemporary Crafts Museum in New York City. He is the curator for the Contemporary Crafts Museum. He's very young. I don't think, maybe still in his 20s at that point. And he somehow takes notice of Clayton Bailey's work, and in 1963 gives him a solo exhibition in a small gallery at the Contemporary Crafts Museum. So Clayton Bailey actually travels to New York City, and I think it was his first time.
And I remember reading, he's like, I did not like it. He's like, it was not for me, but I went anyway.
Nope. But one of the things that he discovered at the time was Robert Arneson's first exhibition of his funk toilets. And this was at the Allen Stone Gallery, I believe. So, you know, Arneson goes very far, very fast between 1961 and 1963, and goes from the object that I just poo-pooed, oh, I'm about to make a bad pun, to actually constructing toilets out of clay. And toilets, you know, by the way, are made of clay, just porcelain. But, you know, these early 1963 and 1964 toilets that Robert Arneson makes are absolutely outrageous. These definitely get Clayton Bailey's attention, and he comes back to Wisconsin. By this point, he has moved to Whitewater, Wisconsin, which is a tiny little town and a state school, an extension of the University of Wisconsin in Whitewater. And he's tasked with building a ceramics program in Whitewater. And he has a group of students around him, including a guy named Dan Gunderson that I actually know, who lives and works in Florida. And they have a remarkable devotion to Clayton Bailey. And they sort of pick up this slogan that Clayton Bailey, I think, likes to bandy about. And someone actually paints it onto the studio wall. And that is the slogan, "Make it ugly." So to think that, you know, between 1961, when the New Ceramics Presence article is published, turning people on to abstract expressionist ceramics, and 1963, when you have students painting this slogan on the walls, it's amazing. And Robert Arneson showing ceramic toilets in a New York gallery. So Clayton Bailey comes back, and he makes his first, like, really awkward, bizarre works that push past the critters. And these are his male urinals.
The
So
Nite pods.
yes, so
I love that. They're hilarious.
They are a direct answer to Robert Arneson and having seen those toilets. But, these are urinals made for men to be able to relieve themselves in the middle of the night. But just as Robert Arneson is doing with the little fingernails on the typewriter, uh, Clayton Bailey is getting a little bit surreal. And so he introduces bright red women's lips on these pots. So he liked to talk directly about function and that these are functional objects. But these sexualized female lips are negating the function in that, if the man were to get an erection, he would not be able to use the pot. So all of this stuff, bodily functions and sex and pottery are all mixed up together in this soup. And I think that this really kicks off Clayton Bailey being an incredible conceptual artist, in addition to being, a boundary-pushing sculptor.
Yeah, and I was actually describing these pots to my students the other day, and one kid had his headphones on and like heard me talk about bright red lips that would be at the top of this urinal. He's like, "What now?" So I just want to say these are like if you look at these pots, they're like sort of tall and skinny. They're almost like a really enlarged spout of like of a giant watering can, right? They sort of sit on the ground and they come up and then they kind of bend, and at the top are these juicy red lips that you would put your genitalia into. Your member, thank you. They're searching for the right kind of podcast language. You would put your member into, and these bright juicy red lips, and you would take care of your business. What I think is even drives home the functional part of it is that there's a handle on the back of it that you can like pick it up and then dump it out the next day, which then brings to mind to me is like the history of chamber pots, right? You would have a little, ceramic pot with a lid, like you'd slide it under your bed. And if you had to relieve yourself in the night, you'd take care of that and put it away in the morning. So he's looking at art history. He's making this work that's really like clever and irreverent and funny and sexy and ugly and like makes you feel a little uncomfortable talking about juicy red lips and your member, right? But they're rooted in all of these things and they're really quite clever. And there's almost like, there's when you see that there's a picture of them of like a collection of them, which I think it sort of like almost like they're plants growing out of the ground as well. And so there's just such kind of funny humor within that work. So how does Clayton Bailey become connected, come to know Robert Arneson?
So it's interesting. There's another Midwestern connection. And, we talked a little bit about functional pots, but the Bernard Leach, shall we say, of American pottery.
I think we also, I'm just going to jump in to say, I think we also have just to say, our British listeners are going to absolutely know who Bernard Leach is, and all ceramic enthusiasts should, but father of the British studio pottery movement, functional pottery that really influences like Minnesota potters in the United States, a kind of a Japanese British aesthetic. So it's sort of this is the opposite of Clayton Bailey.
Absolutely. So Warren Mackenzie hears about what this crazy kid in Wisconsin is doing and invites him to be a part of a conference presentation called Wither the Pot. And they were presenting different takes on pottery and, what contemporary pottery means in an era of plastics. But Clayton Bailey actually writes to quite an amazing group of artists asking for slides. And this is the first time that he actually connects with Robert Arneson, because he asks Robert Arneson for slides. And then they start corresponding. And Clayton Bailey, like many of the artists at the time, was an amazing correspondent. You can go see all of his papers at the Archives of American Art. And there are incredible, spicy, weird correspondences with so many artists of the era. So they definitely had a connection, through correspondence. But Clayton Bailey, after Wisconsin, moves around a little bit. He actually had a director, a guy named Francis Coelho, and Coelho was a bit of an educational theorist, and he was hired by the University of South Dakota in Vermilion to set up an experimental art program. So you could go to Vermilion, South Dakota.
The middle of nowhere.
In the middle, you said it, not me. You're going to have angry South Dakotans like knocking down your door. One of the most radical art programs in the entire United States was in Vermilion, South Dakota.
That's amazing.
And grades weren't sort of given out. You could sort of set your own course of study at your own pace, and they really had kind of a radical faculty. And somehow Clayton Bailey manages to get a sabbatical and go teach for Robert Arneson as a replacement while Robert Arneson is on sabbatical. So this is during the time that he's sort of between Whitewater, Wisconsin, and South Dakota. So he, packs up the car with his wife, Betty, maybe a kid already, and goes out to Davis, and he teaches for an entire semester in Davis, and it's there that he meets David Gilhooly and Peter Vandenberg and, all of Gilhooly's students. Maya Peoples-Bright would have been like around at the time. And really sort of embeds himself. And then he comes back and throws himself into this experimental program in South Dakota. And so it's interesting. I think, we're talking about right around the time of the Funk exhibition.
Right. It's like 60, 67, 68 was the Funk Art Festival.
Yes. So I think it's 1968. Clayton Bailey puts on a festival in Vermilion, South Dakota, and invites David Gilhooly and Maya Peoples-Bright, who's really kind of the amazing ass-kicking female, like in the middle of all of these men. And Maya Peoples-Bright's husband, David Zach, who is a whole other conversation. And, there are all sorts of stories of making art cars and building giant sculptures and having strange performances, and I'll add that the performances and happenings are something that Clayton Bailey had done as far back as 1962 and 1963, and I can guarantee you that those things were not going on among sort of the Davis ceramic students, at least at that point.
And can you tell our listeners just what a happening is?
All right. So happenings, are nonsense artistic performances. They really come out of kind of Black Mountain College and the 1940s and 50s and, John Cage. But there was an artist in particular named Alan Caprow on the East Coast who engineered some of the sort of largest, craziest, art events that always involved, sort of bacchanals, like in certain ways, and combined a lot of things that certainly push back against the idea that some sort of performance would have to have a narrative to hold it all together.
And so Bailey is involved in happenings earlier on in his career. And so it's sort of, we're painting this picture of a person who's had, he's moved all over the middle of the country. I mean, you're from the Midwest. You're a proud Nebraskan son. I sort of forget, I'm from the East Coast, so I sort of forget how massive the middle of the country is. But what we're seeing is he's connecting and he's sort of popping around really broad swaths with massive distances between them, between Wisconsin and St. Louis and South Dakota. And but then he eventually makes his way over to California kind of permanently, where he'd spend the remainder of his life from 1968 to 1996. He teaches at Cal State East Bay, which was originally Cal State Howard. Is that right?
Hayward.
Hayward, sorry, Hayward. And it's there that he really builds this community of friendships and collaborators. You mentioned Maya Peoples Bright and David Zach, and Roy DeForest becomes his neighbor, I think. And so he kind of embeds himself into the funk scene.
And I will say Clayton Bailey is someone who used the word funk. I mean, he put on that funk festival. He created a website for his work where, all of his 1960s and early 70s sculptures, he flat out called them funk. But, like other artists, he wanted to create his own thing and not necessarily trade on funk, which was debated, even though it had spread pretty widely, I think, as a term by 1967, 1968.
So I mean, for me, he's sort of like one of the first of those artists who really claims funk in a way that isn't just sort of, he's not being named funk, he's claiming it. But there's some of those, the group of that group of artists are not so keen on being called funk, right? And so they all come up with nut art.
So so right now we can sort of cleave funk art from funk ceramics, and the two kind of separate. And funk non-ceramics was never really a thing, except to Peter Seltz. But to people within the ceramics world, there's something that resonates about
like galvanizing
funk. It was absolutely galvanizing. Even still, I think Clayton Bailey was looking for a blanket term that was a little bit more inclusive of the group of like-minded people that he had gathered around him, which includes Robert Arneson, by the way. So they're in frequent touch. They are going to the same parties. So Clayton Bailey, when he moved to California, he actually moved his family into a cafe, a diner. And his wife and his two children. There was an amazing documentary called With These Hands that came out in 1970. You can link to it on YouTube. But it was a primetime TV documentary that profiled, I think, 6 craft artists of different stripes. And the ceramic artist Toshiko Takeezu, who you'll talk about later, was one of them. Paul Soldner, who certainly will come up, is one of them. But they profiled Clayton Bailey because there is no more colorful character in American ceramics than Clayton Bailey. They capture him playing his bagpipes around the streets of Crockett, California, and putting on puppet shows with his family inside of the cafe in Crockett. It's absolutely an amazing document. But shortly thereafter, living in the cafe, I think, gets a little bit old. And he's able to buy a property next to the painter Roy DeForest in a place called Port Costa that I think is actually kind of a state park or a protected state area. And so they had these 2 houses together in a very rural area. And it became kind of a party spot. Lots of artists from the Bay Area would come out and, smoke drugs and drink some beer.
As you do.
And yes, one does. And it was supposedly during one of these sessions that, they were all sitting around and they hatched the idea of creating a new art movement called nut art. And they had, I think, all of the. So Stephanie, what do you need for an art movement?
Oh gosh. Okay. Yes, Professor. You need politics, right? You need to
Okay,
be
yeah,
responding something political, social. There needs to be sort of a defining aesthetic that brings people together. What am I missing? I feel like I'm missing a big one.
well, I mean, you know, a
Oh,
manifesto, I
that's right.
think, is
Sorry. Yes.
always,
A manifesto.
but there was this, like you say, you need kind of a shared aesthetic. And one of the things that kind of brings all of the nut artists together, humor certainly is, I think, foremost among them, and a tendency toward narrative, even if it's nonlinear. But I think one of the things that there was room for within nut art that there wasn't necessarily room for in funk was world building
Yeah.
and imagination. And so it's kind of interesting to note that there are three people that I can name within the nut art movement that had difficult childhoods. David Gilhooly, his father was actually a farm inspector for the US government, and they spent long periods of time in Puerto Rico. And he actually spent 2 periods of his life in Puerto Rico. And I think, you know, he was alone a lot. He had to entertain himself, and he was, you know, in a different country. But two other artists genuinely grew up in refugee camps. So Maya Peoples Bright was
Right.
from Eastern Europe,
I think it was Lithuania.
Lithuania, but in the wake of World War II, like her family was decimated and she was sort of moved from camp to camp. And then Peter Vandenberg, who was, you know, one of Arneson's greatest students, grew up in Indonesia. And after the Japanese invasion, he spent 3 years of World War II in an outright concentration camp with his family, and then kicked around after World War II in different refugee camps. And so grew up in sort of absolutely, you know, crazy environments. So those three artists, I think, are really well known for creating these vast worlds of imaginary things.
Alternate realities or universes that
Yeah.
they created to sort of survive in a way.
Yes. David
Yeah.
Gilhooly, I think, is the best known of the three, and he created an entire
Y-
universe of frogs with their
Frogs
own gods and their own political systems and their
and
own
Oreo
myths,
cookies.
their own art history even, and it all fed back upon itself. But I think it was, you know, his isolation certainly as a kid that led to him being able to sort of comfortably retreat into these imaginary worlds.
This is this kind of key defining feature of nut art, or these sort of creation myths, alternative sort of universes in which our art is explored. And so how did Clayton Bailey engage with that part of nut art?
So Clayton Bailey was also about spectacle and
Yeah.
about performance. So one of the first things that he started doing kind of in the era that nut art is starting to emerge around 1971 uh, was that I'm not supposed to use the word alter ego, uh, but there was a scientist who looked suspiciously like Clayton Bailey that was a part of this nut art scene, a guy named Dr. Gladstone. And Dr. Gladstone was kind of an archaeologist, and there is a whole science that Clayton Bailey has outlined, and he was very good at writing in a scientific vernacular. And so basically, he posited that, okay, so I'll make you answer questions again. So um, can you tell me the basics of how a fossil is made over time? So you have organic materials.
Yeah. You have organic materials through time and geological pressure. The bone is turned to stone.
Okay, it's replaced, yes,
Right.
by stone. And so Clayton Bailey posited that in similar ways, Kaolithic materials, aka clay,
Mhm.
over time and pressure and heat can be transformed into Kaolithic specimens, aka these ceramic skeletons that kept appearing. So time after time after time, Dr. Gladstone would be digging, and he would find ceramic skeletons of a Bigfoot or a sea monster. And these were not ceramic, they were Kaolithic. The Kaolithic compounds, through the application of heat, were transmogrified into these Kaolithic skeletons.
He also, you mentioned that he is a sort of consummate performer, and I know that you've had many chats with him over the years before he passed, and I feel lucky enough to have seen him give the closing lecture for NCECA, the National Council for the Education of Ceramic Arts. Gosh, what was that? 2017-ish, maybe?
Something like that.
Something like that. And he gave his whole lecture in the third person, which I loved about this performance. But he also writes, Dr. Gladstone discovers a Bigfoot skeleton in a mudslide near Port Costa. With Lowell Darling, he makes a TV documentary about the discovery. Utilizing the principles of Kaolism, he begins to collect skeletons of mythical animals and create a backyard museum of Kaolithic wonders. He begins lecturing about the Kaolithic wonders of the world that are found. Right. I mean, so it goes sort of on, and there's such a convincing commitment to
he knew
Dr. Gladstone.
He knew how to commit to a bit, for sure.
Gosh, so, it's really amazing.
So Clayton Bailey is, an amazing networker. From the time that he did that Wither the Pot project, he was communicating with all of these other artists. By 1975, he gets a solo exhibition at the De Young Museum in San Francisco, and he decides to make it into a sort of Kaolithic Wonders of the World museum, and doesn't just put objects on display, but instead creates an entire museum display with all of the labels and all of the language that you would normally encounter in a science museum. And he kind of gets so good at that he creates his own personal museum in Port Costa, I believe. Yep. So it becomes the Wonders of the World Museum, and it had merchandise, a gift shop. You have to have a gift shop. It had, all of the things that a museum needs. And, it's hilarious, but he certainly never breaks character. The other thing that I'll mention about all of this is that, he's doing these things in sort of a, white male museum voice of authority, but he's also very interested in the media. So I think there are such amazing connections to the world that we're living in today, where, people don't trust the media. He was very playful with the media and obsessed with the Weekly World News and other tabloids. These were fantastic tabloids in the United States in the 1970s through the 1990s that, loved to put Bigfoot and, other creatures. There was a bat boy that they followed for quite a while. And Clayton Bailey, would tip off both mainstream newspapers and these tabloids whenever he would discover a Kaolithic skeleton. And, so it was pranking the media in a way that really sort of preceded some media pranksters of the 1990s. He was doing it way back in the 1970s.
And what do you think he was teaching us with this work?
I think he was just always following his own North Star, in a certain way. It was humor, and it was pushing back. And so if he wasn't pranking someone or subverting something, it wasn't worth doing. And so I think, his efforts are sort of bifurcated a little bit in that there were genuinely, I think, a lot of puzzled people going to those exhibitions or reading things in the weekly world news. But I think those who were willing to, dig a little bit deeper, were treated to some ideas about, the voice of scientific authority and the voice of art history authority. He did a crazy performance at a conference where he actually wrote to different museums around the country asking if he could borrow some of their best historical ceramic artifacts, like a red figure Greek vase from the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, in order to do an onstage compression test of the pot to see how much pressure that they could receive before they were crushed. And he got back all of these nasty letters from the museum saying, like, of course we're not going to loan you this for this test because it's going to destroy our pot. So he created some homemade identical pots. And then during the conference, he had people dressed up as security guards, carefully bringing them in, and actually constructed an object that would do the compression testing. And I think provided a little bit of extra smoke and spark through some stage effects for a little bit of extra panache.
A little bit of extra panache and flair. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the Bigfoot, because I think the images around that, and again, this sort of commitment to the persona, to the performance, is really incredible in a way that, like, Bigfoot skeleton is found. There's like caution tape. There's Dr. Gladstone in his like white doctor's like he's got like a white coat on. He's got a white.
Don't forget the pith helmet.
Sorry, like the hard hat, and he's there measuring bones with a caliper. And of course, like the funniest bit is the fact that the member of the Bigfoot, when it has an erection, actually curves in, and that's why they're
triple jointed.
Sorry, triple jointed. That's right. Triple jointed.
Yeah. So it is triple jointed, so that during the act of Bigfoot coitus, like you say, because of the triple jointing, it bends in on itself. And this is one of the reasons, according to Dr. Gladstone, that Bigfoot is exceedingly rare.
Right, because it really couldn't procreate. It worked against himself. Can you talk to me a little bit about your relationship with Clayton? Because I know that you were able to conduct several interviews with him, and were kind of a big proponent in advocating for his legacy throughout the field of ceramics, through your writing, through presentations at conferences, and I think that you in particular really have been such a giving Clayton Bailey his due in a ceramic world that maybe was keen to forget him, because he was outlandish and he was embarrassing and he was kind of kooky, and all the wonderful ways that he brought his perspective to ceramics, to nut art, to this alternative world that he sort of built through Dr. Gladstone. Can you just share a little bit about how you came to build that relationship, what it was like to know him, and what you think his legacy is for the broader art world, which I realize is like 14 questions all at once.
Well, I'll say that. So certainly, I want to point out that Clayton Bailey was never forgotten by, his community around him. He morphed from making ceramics into making robots out of like crazy cast-off parts, and was honored with things like a big exhibition of his robots at the San Francisco airport. And so he was constantly sort of interacting with his community. But, Stephanie, you and I both kind of came up in the 1990s in the ceramics world, where I feel like if Robert Arneson, like felt a burden about being labeled as a craft artist and wanted to be thought of as like a fancy sculptor, it was so much worse, I think, in the 90s. And, artists used lots of talk about French literary theory and semiotics and all sorts of other things to sort of validate themselves. And funk really fell out of fashion. And so truly, on a national level, nobody cared. But, in my young career, I moved up to way northern California.
You sure
Up
did.
in the Redwoods, Eureka, California.
Woohoo!
And the Bay Area was a place where I could come for culture and, museums and food. And Clayton Bailey being in the North Bay was kind of on my way. And so initially I just, wanted to ask him some questions and was invited to his studio for a tour. And I still have the amazing photos of that tour. And he was so gracious. He was so interested in passing on the lore, I think, to a young person who cared. And he started introducing me to the other nut artists like Maya Peoples-Bright and Peter Vandenberg. And, he opened up a lot of doors for like really great research. And so getting to tour Clayton's house was one of the greatest pleasures. He created all of these like pop guns that were pneumatic and made from spare parts like his robots, and he would shoot corks at you as you walked through his studio. He also loved to wink a little bit, and he would open up a drawer, and there was a collection of ceramic marijuana pipes from back in the nut art days. And we have to remember that, Crockett, where he was living in Port Costa, was not a bohemian area. It was a very working class area. And so particularly his wife, Betty, was paranoid because police were around. They actually had kids running around. So Betty invented something called the paranoid pipe. And so these are marijuana pipes made out of clay and glazed with hobby glazes in the forms of flowers. And there's a pangolin that David Gilhooly made that is incredible. And Clayton Bailey at some point actually, in inscribing his catalog from a great retrospective that happened at the Crocker Museum of Art, he inscribed it to me as his partner in mischief. And that's how I thought of my relationship with Clayton Bailey. He loved practical jokes. He loved pranks. And I don't know, I get to be one of the people who keep those things alive.
So I think that to conclude our conversation today, we could sort of take a few minutes to sum things up. And I'd like to say that, like, ultimately, Clayton Bailey and his work, his theatrical performances, not alter ego, I think he's actually pivotal. I think he's perhaps, certainly in the 90s for us, was really misunderstood. His commitment to humor, pseudoscience, and kind of pushing the boundaries of what ceramic art could be or is, I think it's secured him a lasting and unique legacy of sort of 20th, 21st century ceramics. And I wonder if you have any concluding thoughts about that as well.
My final thought is that Clayton Bailey might be the greatest conceptual ceramic artist of all time. If you look at any project that he did, he never did it halfway. He always connected them. It was grounded in art history. It was grounded in science, the media, communications. If one steps back and looks at Clayton Bailey's career, it is one big, amazing piece of conceptual art. It's just all wrapped in humor. He knew how to take a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down.
So I want to thank you, Garth, for joining me today on this episode of The History of Ceramics. To find out more and to see all of the works that we've been talking about in this episode and all of our episodes, go to HENI.com/The History of Ceramics. Or you can find us on the HENI Talks YouTube channel and give us a follow wherever you get your podcasts. Goodbye.